Hi, and welcome to another episode of Rule of Carnage. This is where myself, Glenn Ford, have chats with this chap, Mike Hutchinson.
Hello.
We're a couple of games designers. Mike has written Gaslands Refueled, A Billion Suns, and a range of other bits and pieces. Mystic Skies, check out the t-shirts. I have helped him write several of these. I have also put out some games of my own. And we're chatting today, as we often are, about how to design better miniatures games. Specifically today, we're chatting about, we did a previous video on dice and another video on dice pools, and obviously dice are very prevalent in these sorts of games. We're going to have a little chat today about using cards, generally decks of standard playing cards, but we might sort of have a conversation about the options in relation to that.
Yeah, certainly, and talking about custom decks and other kinds of square cardboard things that you might be using.
Yeah, ways of using cards as your random number generator, and maybe some other things you can use cards for other than random number generation.
Certainly,
much as we chatted about in relation to dice. So in the first part of the conversation, we're going to have a little chat about the more sort of mechanical end of things, the affordances that cards offer, the things they can do, and maybe some of the things that they can't do. So Mike, I know obviously you've used cards in A Billion Suns. You've used it in a few other designs. And it's something that I think it feels to me like you're gravitating towards earlier and earlier in your designs. What sorts of affordances and handy things and cool stuff do you like that cards can do that is the reason you use them for?
Yeah, so I think we will go through probably quite a long list of affordances, and that's perhaps why I reach for cards quite early in my design process, because they've got lots and lots and lots of lovely, delicious possibilities inside them. But I think one of the things that quite often drags me towards them initially is their 4 suits and 2 colors, which provide, like, I don't know, that's just a really ordered set of things, quite a small number of things that you can quite often poke bits of your kind of theme into. So when I was working on the campaign system for Gaslands, I wrote a separate little space trading game to sort of explore the loops of campaign resourcing. And you get a deck of cards, you think about space trading, and you go, oh well, diamonds are minerals, and hearts are medical supplies, and blah 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 blah. And that kind of, like, that sort of initial attraction of the suits, I think, is one of them. But yeah, let's talk about, like, the basic affordances are the cards have numbers on them. That's great. Numbers are useful, and those numbers go from roughly 1 to 10, which is a good decimal base. That's useful. But then they also have these other picture cards, and those picture cards can either be all used as a single, like, 11, or they can be used as an 11, 12, 13. And then the ace can be either a 1 or a 14, or a 1 and a 14, or an 11. Like, it's really flexible. Like, the selection of numbers available to you when you're thinking about designing with playing cards, I find is super interesting. And then you've got the suits, so that gives you a 4. Then you've got the colors, which gives you a 2. Then you've got odds and evens, which of course you have with dice, but you have them again here. And then also, if you rank the suits, you've got actually numbers from, like, sort of 2 to 56 just available to you. And you've also got jokers, which you can consider using, and can in some cases be black and red jokers. Doesn't always be is not always represented that way in every pack of playing cards, so you have to be a bit nervous about that. And even within all of that loveliness of suits and colors and numbers, you've also got the sort of cultural understanding of poker hands, and the way that numbers can run in sequences or can be collected into sets. Like, that is just a ton of stuff that you can do and play with. And so as I'm looking at a design and I'm finding a piece of the design that needs to be about sort of 8 shaped or 12 shaped or 2 shaped. I could achieve those with dice, but then I could also achieve those with cards, and then I'm immediately jumping to all of the other lovely affordances that cards provide to see whether in a miniature wargame design or miniature tabletop design, I can, instead of using dice, I can do a ton more because cards have all these other things going in.
Yeah. And so I think first of all, there's that the number of different random numbers that a single card can generate. So in a single pack of cards, like you say, you've got a D2, you've got a D4, you've got a D, whatever ends up being for you, 10, 11, 13, 14, 52, whatever, all within that same stack without asking people to sort of pick up, unusually shaped polynomial dice. Also, I think one of the things is that cards naturally carry all that information on each flip of the card. So with a dice,
that's right.
You roll the dice and you've got a number. And if you want to attach anything to that number, you've then got to do it with tables and rules and bits of text. Whereas with a card, okay, this card is a 10. It's also red. It's also a heart. Obviously Malifaux, I think, was one of the first games to leverage a lot of that with the trigger abilities that they have. For people who haven't played Malifaux, in Malifaux, you take tests by flipping out cards for the number, but minis will have things like, okay, if you succeed, but you get, this suit, you will succeed and do X. Whereas if you succeed with this other suit, you will succeed and do Y. Mm-hmm. And that's something that you can do with cards that you can't really get away with dice. Certainly with dice, when you attempt to do that, you end up doing like an embedded table or a secondary roll. So you'll say like the equivalent of dice will normally be roll your dice. If you succeed, plus then you roll a second dice to see what the additional effect you might get.
That's right. And that's because dice, and even dice pools, tend to only have these very discrete or these very singular results. Whereas, as you say, a single card can present at least 3 or 4 pieces of information straight off the face of the card. Mm-hmm. I guess before we get into some of the more technical affordances, the other great thing from my perspective, as I'm thinking about making quite complicated designs that maybe need 4s and 6s and 12s and 8s and stuff in it, is that a deck of cards is extremely inexpensive and extremely ubiquitous. Like, it's very, very likely that a player of games has a deck of standard playing cards in their house. The flip side of that is, because having a bag of D6 is the thing that you are probably taking to club, should you turn up to club with a game that requires a deck of playing cards, right now it's quite unlikely that somebody has just stashed a deck of standard playing cards in their gaming bag. And that, I think, is, as we get to some of the second half of the conversation about how you can use cards, one consideration is, are you requiring a single deck of cards shared through by all players, or are you asking every player to bring their own deck of cards? Because that, I think, reduces the accessibility, even though playing cards are so ubiquitous.
Yeah, it's weird in relation to accessibility with gamers, because I think for normal,
it's quite specific, yeah.
For normal human beings, the odds of owning like a D6 are quite high, and the odds of owning a deck of cards are quite high, and the odds of owning a D8 are very, very low.
Sure, but with even more with gamers, like, the odds of owning 30 D6 are extremely high.
Yes. Whereas with a gamer, it's sort of like the odds of owning a D6 and D8, a D10, a D12, a D20, and a set of D4s and a deck of playing cards, probably about the same. The odds of being at a club with a handful of D8 is probably up here, and the odds of being at a club with a deck of cards is probably down here. So
yeah, that's right.
But yeah.
So I guess I'm going to rip through a bunch of affordances, and we'll talk about them for some small amount of time in order not to explode this episode into a 90-minute marathon. So one thing about cards is that you can bring out 2 cards and they can match or they can not match. That's sometimes called snap, but that's a thing that can happen in a way that's really nice. It can also be done with dice, but I think it feels very natural with cards. The critical one, and probably the one that we'll end up coming back to a number of times, is that decks of cards have memory, and that is super duper duper. And that's something that dice don't have. And it's not that one is better and one is worse, it's that they are offering really different functions. And one of the things about deck having memory is that players themselves can count cards and they can remember what they've seen or where they've seen it, or they can know that they haven't seen a particular card yet, or be uncertain about where a particular card is. And that, I think, can add a lot of potential loveliness. But I think, as we'll maybe talk a bit more about in the uses of cards, it is also an area of consideration about whether the game becomes more about remembering where cards are than it is about playing with miniatures.
Yeah. I think you can give players options, because you can let people check a discard pile or not. And my instinct would always be allow people to check the discard pile, because otherwise you're making it a game about who's got the best card counting memory.
Yeah.
But hope that people don't therefore every turn recheck the discard pile, and because there is an option to slow the game down with that in a way that there is with dice. Yeah.
And so another thing about decks of cards particularly is that they can be prepared or built in advance of the game, and that has a number of different impacts. So one is that you can stack decks to shape the pacing or the structure of the game. Now, you see this quite often in board games where, for example, the deck that generates the dungeon rooms has the powerful or the boss room kind of buried in the bottom 3 cards, or you go through different ages of the epochs and you bury the more powerful cards at the bottom. And so that's, I think, a really interesting thing that you can do, is that you can actually have some control on the pacing of your miniatures game by using cards. But the other preparing thing is that you can, of course, use it in a way where you've given, like in a deck building type situation, like Warhammer Underworlds or similar games like that. You can give people the cards to assemble into their deck, and you can give them the ability to prepare their deck in advance. What else can you do with cards? People can play them. It feels very natural to play them singly or in pairs or in groups, and I think that's where you get to sort of the poker hand stuff, or the like, here's a number but I want to add on a suit as a rider.
I think one of the big things about cards is it's supernatural to have a hand of cards.
Yeah.
In a way that it isn't for dice, and it's supernatural to say to somebody, you have your hand and you can replace. So you have flipping of cards. So you
just to hang on that point, like the critical thing there is, so it's lovely because they become a resource. Like, they can be a resource in a way that dice can, but it's a lot more fiddly, because when you've got a set of dice in front of you, it's very easy to knock them off their numbers, and it's very difficult to conceal what they are. Whereas if you have a card that only has one value printed on the reverse side of it, I can manipulate those cards, pick them up, look at them, check them, stack them up, move them around, and everyone's pretty confident that the numbers on those cards aren't changing. So they can be a resource that's both hidden and sort of manipulable in a way that dice just cannot really practically function in that way.
Yeah, I think very, very quick, a way that's very easy for people to understand is you've got a deck of cards, you've got a hand of cards, you've got cards that are in play, and you've got a discard pile of cards.
Those all feel normal and natural.
And you can play a card from your hand, you can flip a card off of your deck, you can search for cards, you can hunt for cards. Whereas with dice, you've got a dice and you've got rolling the dice. And that's it. That's what you've got with dice. And maybe you can note them and store them, but that's really quite tricky. And sometimes you can re-roll a dice and that's it. And very, very, very occasionally a game will let you spin a dice to a specific facing, but that's incredibly rare, and hardly ever turns up. Whereas as soon as you've got a deck of cards, it seems immediate and obvious to say, okay, you get the random card that you flip off the top of the deck, but you get cards in your hand. And so occasionally you can choose to put a card into play.
Yeah, and so as we're talking about cards being resources, which I think is one of the most interesting uses of them, it's worth noting that they can be limited and unlimited resources very naturally. So you can have a deck of cards, and when you get through that deck of cards, that's it. Or you can have a deck of cards that once it's been got through, you shuffle the discard pile and it returns. or you can have cards where if you draw one and then play it, you immediately draw another one. So like the limitedness or unlimitedness, the speed with which cards cycle and resources become available again, like all of that, there's loads to play with in the design. And I know that like in some regards this is just maybe board game design as well, like none of this stuff is miniature game specific, but because I don't see as much tabletop miniature games sort of utilizing all of this lovely affordance that playing cards are, like I feel quite passionate about examining this stuff because I think that there's loads of cool things that you can do with it. And you know, there's plenty of places where people are using this, but I think that more could be done.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that board games have been sort of examining cards, and playing card games are a traditional format of game, and they've been examining the things you can do with a deck of cards, how you can pull them, cycle them, stack them, shift them, in a way that there's like, you know, a handful of games based around just rolling dice, and there's a huge number of games based around just pulling and playing cards. And so I think in a way the mechanics that are inherent to just a deck of cards have both been more heavily examined and are more quickly familiar to people than the mechanics surrounding the rolling of dice. It's like, you know, dice bag building and dice worker placement are still considered like quite revolutionary sort of mechanics in board games, and quite new, and everyone's going, you know, whereas the various things you do with playing cards, the equivalents of that, are sort of as old as the hills, and everybody knows them and they've been well examined and sort of looked into.
So again, still on the theme of resources, as well as being limited and unlimited, they're also they are discrete, particularly if everyone's sharing a deck. Then because I've got this card, you don't have this card, and that can be super interesting, and that might be a good thing for your design, or it might be a bad thing, and therefore everyone needs to have their own deck. And then because I have this card now, I'm not going to have this card later, potentially. So that discreteness, that sort of exclusiveness of that resource is super interesting, or that can be player exclusive. We've talked about the fact that they can be hidden. So they can be hidden, they can be revealed, they can be bluffed. That I think is super interesting. Dice rarely, it's tough to make dice be a secret information, as we've talked about, I think, in previous conversations. But with cards, it's the most natural thing in the world, and you know, it's almost expected of the object for it to be face down until an exciting moment of, haha, this was the card I had.
Yeah, bluffing is cool and it's fun and it's player interaction. It's one of the most human moments you'll get in a lot of games is bluffing and eyeballing the other person.
And when we roll dice, we sometimes anthropomorphize the results of those dice. But when you flip a card off the top of a deck, like that was the card that was there. It was never going to be anything other than that card. And there's like, I know it's just a random chance, but because of the physical reality of the fact that when I turn that kind of card over, like, yep, that's the card it was. Like that's a very, it has an additional, I think, emotional resonance for the person who personifies luck in their random objects.
Well, I think personally, more to the point, people anthropomorphize the roll of a dice and the flip of a card, but the card I chose to put face down and is hidden information, and therefore essentially to you random, but not to me, really does have a thought behind it. You know what I mean? It's like someone rolls the dice and is chanting for a 6. It's like the dice doesn't care, it can't hear you, and there's no actual reality to the drama if it comes up as 6 or not. Whereas if I've got to pick, you know, a 5 or an 8, and then you've got to figure out which one I picked, that's a real thing when I flip it over and I got it right or I got it wrong.
That's the situation where my wife Vanessa will say, she will look carefully at your nose, and your nose will be very subtly indicating the one that you don't want me to pick. That's her psychic trick, apparently.
I mean, this is a random possible side conversation, but I came to a discussion with somebody who was saying, so a game says that somebody picks a card randomly from your hand, and they can always tell with their partner that they're playing with which card they don't want them to pick, no matter how much they shuffle them, etc., etc. And so their partner started shuffling the cards and then put them face down without looking at them for the person to pick the card randomly. And that person insisted that that was cheating. You not looking at your cards in order to force the selection to be random is you cheating.
This is how I play Skull and Roses as well. I shuffle my discs and I just put one down. I don't even know what it is, and I maintain eye contact like a badass.
And it's it has to be said, there are a few minor sort of wordings around. You've got to be a little bit more careful, I think, with your definitions and your wordings with cards than you do with dice sometimes. If you
essentially, it depends how important secrecy and the moment of the reveal is, and
well, just little technicalities. It's like if you want a fun day or so, go and read the thread on Board Game Geek about whether or not you can shuffle a single card. and if a game says shuffle your deck and there's only one card in your deck, if you cannot shuffle a single card, what do you do? What then happens? Are you meant to reshuffle your discard pile? And at that point, can I really shuffle two cards? So there are little things where some people will, where you can have minor breakdowns with decks of cards.
Right. So I think that I think you are risking a derailment at this point. So continuing on the affordances, all the loveliness that cards can provide to you. So we were talking about hidden information and revealing and bluffing. You were talking, I think, there about being able to hide cards. You can replace cards. One thing that's really interesting about, for example, the way that Malifaux uses the deck of cards as the random sequence of random numbers is that when you mess up in the middle of a turn, you can actually replay the random number generator in a way that, for a certain kind of person, is quite satisfying, because we've all been there where we rolled a bunch of 5s and 6s with some dice, then realized that we were rolling for the wrong thing, and then there's the sort of moment of what's the word I'm looking for? That sort of social moment where it's like, well, can I just restate that was for my saving throws because I thought I had a to hit still to go. And I am the sort of person who will always pick up the dice and re-roll them because even if I've got a good roll, I just figure like that's just the way I approach it. But with a deck of cards, you can say, oh, wait a minute, let's just put that one back. And then that one can be the thing, and then that one can be the thing. Of course, there's the risk there that if you put that one back, then you know that there's a 3 coming off the deck next.
Although that obviously is an option for a mechanic where you can build in the ability to restack the deck.
That's right. Yeah. You could rewind time in a way that could be thematically interesting. Knowing what's about to happen or the success with which it's going to happen, you could use that. We talked at the beginning a bit about sort of poker hands and pairs and stuff. I think there's quite a lot to go there. There's also the trading of cards. So you can have a resource trading thing in a way that's super interesting. And they have a physicality about them, so that gives you a couple of different affordances. One is that they have a short edge and a long edge, and there are some games that have used that as a measuring widget or a turning thing. And because they're physical things, they can also have, if you choose to make it matter, they could have a physical location. So as well as placing them into play, they're useful because you can place them into play. You can put them down next to a figure or down next to a unit to indicate some status or some ability, but you can also use them literally as a positional marker. So you could say, well, this is a little deployment zone, or this is an area of where the model is presumed to be, or this is an area of an objective. And because they can be upside down, you can go, well, this is an objective and this is an objective. And when you get there, you can reveal that card to find out, oh, that area of the board was a 2 of hearts. And there's a ton that you can do, I think, with that when it comes to scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. So you say there are games that use the short edge and the long edge. There aren't as many as I would like to see that use the fact that the cards are a preset physical size. They're a blast template. They're a thing where you can go, okay, if you can get the corners on each of your models, maybe the rest of the card does something. It's a really cheap easily affordable way of giving, you know, a whole set of 3-dimensional, 2 to 3-dimensional positional rules to the players in a very quick and easy to understand way.
Yeah, that's without even getting into the fact that maybe you have card tower building dexterity rules in your game. But
well, yeah, we should always have more dexterity rules in games. But that's,
I think one thing that I find quite interesting is that they allow you to search for a certain object. So I refer to this as a find the pickle mechanic, but like you can hide a particular, you know, like an ace of spades or something, you can hide that in a set number of cards to create a predictable descending chance of finding the thing that's needed. And I find that really interesting because if there's something that you want to happen, it must happen for the game's narrative to trigger, but you want some uncertainty about when that's going to happen, then using a specific trigger card and hiding it in a certain number of other non-triggering cards, I think is a really useful affordance.
Yeah, I think the equivalency to this in a lot of games is roll a d6. If a 6 comes up, X happens. The second time you roll, add 1 to the roll,
right.
Add 2 to the roll, add 3 to the roll, add 4 to the roll. And that's always slightly less satisfying. And it's always annoying when the game forgets to do the add X.
Right, and so it's entirely possible, and therefore will happen for some players, that they never find the pickle and the game just stalls out.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think probably the last thing on my list was a sort of cultural connection to gambling and the American Old West and Las Vegas. And like there's a bunch of sort of slightly subtler cultural affordances where, because these decks of cards have these associations, you can use that to sort of inspire the fantasy a bit more richly. That's clearly why the Weird West game Malifaux does it, but lots of other Old West style skirmish games, I think, rightly use a deck of cards. And, you know, frankly, when I see a cowboy game that's using D6, I kind of wonder what they're thinking.
And that's what I'm curious about, because I think that happens because cards are so unused in these sorts of games. They still have their these sorts of games references attached to them. Because I was trying to think about, well, what do dice say to you thematically? Well, they don't say anything anymore because they're so ubiquitous. They've now become this kind of thing. And, you know, if half of all tabletop minis games used cards, I don't think we'd have those associations with them anymore. So it's interesting that it can give you some theme for now. Maybe
right, yeah, you know, yes,
if it becomes super popular. I mean, it's interesting because, of course, a normal deck of those playing cards has those associations. There are other slightly more obscure decks of cards that are still relatively easy to get a hold of. Tarot cards are not incredibly difficult to get a hold of.
No, you can. I mean, in most high streets, you'll find somewhere that you can pick up a deck of tarot cards, whether that's a Waterstones bookshop or, you know, the local joss stick seller.
And most people will have to go out and acquire a deck of tarot cards, but that's super thematic, you know, for something.
Yeah, for a horror game or an occult game or a mystical game or a magician's game. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and if you want to get a little bit sort of more obscure, there are alternative versions of the normal deck of cards available.
And the tarot deck is interesting because it has all those affordances we've talked about. It just extends them. So, you know, there's all the numbers, but they have different suits. And then there's all these other flavorful kind of face cards to mess around with. I think with a deck of tarot cards, I think you run the risk of having to do a bit more mapping, maybe having a table of like what all these different I can't remember what's the name of those, like
the major arcana.
Major arcana, thank you. Yes, so I can imagine having to have a table of major arcana and be like, oh, okay, flipped out death, what does that mean?
Although equally major arcana are themselves numbered. They can just use them as a straight up separate set of numbers to generate.
And then, as you say, there are slightly more obscure playing card variants. So there's like older Italian decks of cards with slightly different selections of numbers. I have a couple of those sets, and every time I sort of wander in their direction, I just figure the most of the affordances that I could extract from them are already in a standard deck of cards, and you can buy those in every, in every airport sort of convenience store. So why not go with the ubiquitous one?
Yeah, it's tricky as to when you go for something properly obscure, are you just going to be making a custom deck of cards? I mean, I cannot remember the name of it, but in Japan they have a different set of playing cards to us that have a different set of suits and affordances and etc etc. But it's like they're so obscure and difficult to get a hold of, in the West, that it's like I'm just doing custom cards at that point, and maybe I should just create a whole deck completely of my own.
Yeah, and we haven't really been making a distinction rather between using standard cards and using custom cards. I think in this conversation, we may in the next, but I think most of the affordances that we've talked about, particularly the physical ones and the numerical ones and the hidden and open ones, like those are all true regardless of whether you have invented the faces of your cards or whether you're using standard playing cards. But inventing the faces of your cards can introduce lots of other lovely hooks and stuff, but at a cost, which I guess we'll probably talk about in the next conversation.
Yeah. So I think we've covered the affordances that you can achieve with a deck of cards in this conversation. It's literally, I think it's significant how many options they give you, in that just covering the options has taken a fairly solid conversation. I think
that's why I'm so excited about cards. I just think they're so brilliant.
We'll come back in a second and maybe talk about this, because there's a couple of things that decks of cards can't do, and we'll sort of I think we'll have a little mention of those. We'll talk about some of the options for, let's say, custom decks of cards, and some of the things you can physically do with cards on a tabletop that are
we'll link this a bit more into the actual designing of miniature games.
But for now, that's a chat about just the raw mechanics of the affordances of cards that you can achieve that are handy, useful, and interesting for a tabletop miniatures game. We will come back in just a minute and talk about more and more things to do with using cards instead of dice, or next to dice in your game. There's no reason that it has to be either or. But for now, if you've watched through to this point, please do like and subscribe. Drop us a comment in the comment section. There aren't a massive number of games that use playing cards, but maybe you've seen one that's a little obscure that you're a big fan of, that you love the way that they use a particular suit or set of cards, or engage with hands and draw decks and blah 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 and all those sorts of things. So let us know your favorite use of cards in a tabletop skirmish game. For now though, look us up on social media. I think it's going to be a thank you and goodbye from us. So thanks and goodbye.
Goodbye. Thanks.